Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, there was a man who worked as a woodcutter. After he used to be rich, and all his money was stolen. His wife was dead, and he lived in a cottage near a dark forest with his two children, Hansel and Gretel, and their stepmother. Hard times came upon the land, and nobody could afford to buy his wood. There was very little food in the cottage. One night, the woodcutter was unable to sleep. "What are we going to do?" he asked his wife. "We have only enough bread for two," his wife said quietly. "I have an idea. Tomorrow morning we will take the children into the woods, light a fire, and give them some bread. Then we will leave them on their own." "No!" cried her husband. "We cannot do such a thing." The stepmother nagged and cried that the whole family would starve. At last, the poor man agreed to her plan. The children heard every word. When their father and stepmother had fallen asleep, Hansel got up and stepped outside. He filled his pockets with white pebbles that gleamed in the moonlight. When Hansel returned, he whispered, "Go to sleep, Gretel. We will be fine." At dawn, the stepmother cried, "Get up! We must fetch some wood." As they walked along, Hansel dropped the stones to mark their way. When they reached the middle of the forest, their father said, "I will light a fire." "Sit down and rest," said their stepmother. "We will come and get you when we are done." Hansel and Gretel warmed themselves by the fire. At noon, they ate the bread their stepmother had left them. Then they fell asleep. When they woke, it was dark. Hansel took his sister's hand and followed the gleaming white pebbles. At dawn, they reached their house. Their father was so relieved. He gathered them into his arms. Hard times again came to the land. Again the children heard their stepmother's heartless plan. Hansel tried to go outside to gather pebbles, but their stepmother had barred the door. The next day, Hansel crumbled his bread, leaving a trail. But at night, there were no crumbs to follow home. The birds had eaten them. The poor children wandered the forest in search of home, until they saw a beautiful white bird sitting on a branch. It sang sweetly, then flew out in front of them. The bird led them to a little house made of gingerbread. The roof was made of candy, and the windows were made of sugar. "Food, at last!" Hansel exclaimed. "I will start with the roof. You can have the window." Hansel broke off a piece of candy shingle. At that moment, a shrill voice called from inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse. Who is nibbling my house?" The children were so hungry and the candy house was so delicious that they went right on eating. Suddenly, the door opened. Out hobbled an old woman leaning on a stick. Hansel and Gretel were so terrified that they dropped everything. The old woman shook her head and said, "Come inside. I will not hurt you." She took them both by the hand and led them into the house. She fed them a delicious supper and put them to bed. The old woman was really a witch. The candy house was a trap she used to catch unsuspecting children. Early in the morning, the witch locked Hansel in the stable. Then she went back to wake Gretel. "Get up, lazy bones," she ordered. "Make breakfast for your brother. When he is fat, I will eat him." Gretel cried, but she did as she was told. Every morning the old woman hobbled out to the stable and said, "Hansel, put out your finger. I want to see if you are getting fat." The old woman was almost blind. Hansel fooled her by holding out a chicken bone instead of his finger. She wondered why the boy stayed so thin. After 4 weeks, she decided to eat him anyway. The next day, the old hag called Gretel. "I have already heated the oven," she said. "Climb in and see if it's hot enough for the bread." "I do not know how," Gretel said. "Nonsense," said the hag. "Look, it is easy." The witch crawled toward the hot oven. Gretel shoved the witch into the oven, shut the door, and fastened the bolt. We are free! The old witch is dead!" Gretel cried to Hansel. In the witch's house, they found a box filled with jewels. Hansel and Gretel remembered that their father was rich and that this box belonged to him, but was stolen some day. "We have our father's jewels back!" shouted Hansel. "This is true, and this box is our father's property." Then they hurried through the woods, looking for their way home. At last they saw their house and knew that their cruel stepmother was gone. All of their troubles were over, and they lived happily ever after.